If you don't know him and his wife, Joan, they own the quilt shop Sweet Stitches in Chesterton, Indiana. If you kind of went through your uh what is it anyway, I can't think of the word right now, but he is also a Janome and Elna authorized dealer. He's a representative and is the Janome Elna certified warranty and maintenance technician. So you have one of those machines, you can take it to Sweet Stitches. But this month, Rob is going to talk to us about our sewing machines, maintenance, things that we can and cannot do, and things to help us prevent from having big mistakes in terms of working with our machines. So, and I want to encourage each of you, it's such a wonderful shop. If you haven't been there, you need to take a little trip down to Chesterton, Indiana, and peek into their shops and talk with Joan and the staff. It's a wonderful place. But this morning, I'd like to introduce to you Bob Crookson from Sweet Stitches of Chesterton, Indiana.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Connie. I appreciate the invite from you and Sandy.
Here comes the mute all. So Rob, you have to unmute, I think. So here we go. Okay. All right, Rob, here we go.
I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you just fine.
All right, good. Well, anyhow, thank you again for the invitation. I certainly appreciate the chance to be here. And Joan says her hellos as well this morning. The shop is open. That's why I have the headsets on, just in case there's some background noise. I can focus. But anyhow, yeah, we want to chat about sewing machines. And as Connie had said, we are a Janome and Elna authorized dealer, but our repair shop handles all makes and models. So I see it all coming through our shop. Vintage machines, new machines, you name it, they come through. And so I just wanted to spend a little bit of time, and I appreciate the opportunity to do so, talking to this Quilters Plus group as far as maybe what I'm going to call a little bit of tips and tricks on, with sewing machines that you may or may not know, things that may improve your project outcomes, and especially when things aren't working quite right. As you're moving through a project, what you might be able to do to correct those or make an adjustment to your machine. So we just wanted to chat a little bit about that. I'm going to share my screen, at least one of them, just briefly here with you. And hopefully this should be popping up on your screen. You should see a little PowerPoint.
Yep, we see it.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So what I plan on chatting about today is kind of this list of topics. So we're going to chat about presser foot pressure and some adjustments and why. We'll discuss upper tension and tension in general, thread sizing, the needle anatomy, and why it's important to understand a little bit about that and its operation in regard to the machine. We're going to talk and look at some sewing feet so we can discuss the differences between these feet and why you would use one foot over another depending on your application. We're going to kind of, we'll say tie all that together or maybe stitch it all together into some basics of operation. And then we're also going to talk about maintenance of your machines, things that you may want to consider as you're working through your projects. So I'm going to stop sharing this. We'll come back to this PowerPoint. I got a few pictures to show you later. So that should have disappeared. So the first topic that I'd like to discuss is presser foot pressure. And interestingly enough, this is one of those features on most every sewing machine that very few sewists use. It tends just to sit in the same spot, or it tends to get changed once and it never gets adjusted. But presser foot pressure is the amount of force that your machine is pushing down on your presser foot. So you have that presser foot. When you lower your presser foot, it's pushing down against your feed dogs, and your fabric is in between there. Well, for the vast majority of sewing machines, that is an adjustable pressure. And so think of it this way. If you're doing standard piecing, you have two pieces of fabric between your presser foot and your feed dogs. Well, the amount of pressure that you need to allow that fabric to draw through is somewhat, it's kind of, I'll call it middle of the road. Many times, if you have a high and a low setting, it's right in the middle if you're piecing. And what that allows the fabric to do is to be drawn through without being stretched. All right. So if your presser foot pressure is too high, what happens is your feed dogs are pulling in one direction, right? They're always going to be pulling that fabric away from you. But we all learn this in school, that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And so if you increase the force, the downward force on your presser foot, and you have a feed dog that's moving your bottom fabric, believe it or not, your upper fabric goes the opposite way. That's the equal and opposite reaction. And I'm sure some of you have been in that circumstance where you carefully cut and aligned and began to sew a block, only to find out at the end they were different lengths. Oftentimes, that is caused by too much downward pressure, and you're literally stretching and pushing the top fabric in the opposite direction of the movement of the feed dogs. So kind of a interesting feature that almost all machines allow you to adjust. And to that end, I'm going to show you a couple of machines here. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the video camera that I'm using. Okay, you should be seeing my other camera here, and I'm going to try to move this in a way that you all don't get dizzy. So I apologize, but I've got to hold it in my hand here. All right, I'm going to kind of pull in on this. Unfortunately, I can't see a big picture of this, but you're looking at a Singer featherweight. All right? So even back this far in time, that button right there, let me make sure you can see it. That button right here, that is your presser foot pressure on a Singer featherweight. Now, if I come back over here, I'm going to let that zoom in. I pulled this machine from down in the workshop. I was working on this for somebody. And if I go to the top of this machine, just a very basic Singer sewing machine, that button right there, that is the adjustment for the presser foot pressure. Now, some machines actually have this inside a door or under a cabinet. Some of them actually have a dial. Some of the older Kenmores, for example, there was a dial up here. Some of them have a bar on the front of the machine. They're all a little different. I'm going to scan over here and show you, this is a newer, this happens to be an Elna sewing machine. And in this machine, the presser foot pressure adjustment is actually right here. And it has 7 settings. So you can click through 7 different settings. The setting to use on this particular machine for piecing is a 5. Now, I say that because that's kind of a middle of the road, little to the high end of the band. However, if we were to, I'm going to just come down here and show you, I've got a 1/4 inch foot on this particular machine right now. And so if I were to drop that presser foot, the pressure is going to be pretty substantial. And I would encourage you to do this on your machine. If you reach back and try to pull this up, you'll feel how difficult it is. But if I reduce that number, it becomes very easy. And so that is important to know. You would want to reduce the amount of pressure that you are going to put on a fabric, especially if you are doing quilting. If you have a quilt sandwich, if you are doing something like bags where you have a stiff medium between your fabric, you need to reduce that pressure. By reducing that pressure, it allows the fabric to move smoothly and evenly under the presser foot. Now, for those of you who may have even newer type of a machine, maybe an electronic machine, this one happens to be, it's a Janome. I don't even know if I can see that with all the lights on this one. But this is a Janome. It happens to be a computerized sewing machine. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit. But if I touch this button, if I try to, there we go, sorry. Right here on the computer screen is the presser foot pressure adjustment on a computerized machine. There is nothing up here. So it's all controlled electronically. So if you have, one of the brand new Brothers sewing machines, the computerized ones, if you have like an Epic or maybe some of, I'm going to change my camera here, so bear with me. I don't have I just turned off my video, sorry about that. I don't have a production assistant with me, so I got to do all this myself. There I am. So it's important to consider that. I'll give you a quick story. Just the other day, Joan, my wife, she was working on bags. If any of you saw her grab bag demo day video, she had made a bunch of bags, and she was making one that was exceptionally thick. And she had called me over and said, I'm really having trouble pulling this through this machine. Well, lo and behold, it had everything to do with presser foot pressure. We changed it to the correct pressure, and the bag flowed right under the machine. So it's the same thing with your quilts. Anything that's thick, you want to reduce that pressure. And it's okay, play with it. Get it to where it just starts to pull. That's the goal. All right, so number 2 we want to chat about is upper tension. Really, it's simply tension. So what is tension? Tension is kind of this tug of war that goes on between the bobbin thread and the upper thread. And so the goal is to balance these so that stitch that is formed is created right in the middle of the fabric or your quilt sandwich or whatever it is. You should just barely see the top of a bobbin thread when you're looking at the top of your fabric. And likewise, if you turn it over, you should see just the top of the upper thread on the bottom. And so the goal with tension is to have those in balance. And I know I hear it all the time. Folks come in and, I never touch my tension. I was always told never touch it. There's a dial for a reason. It's adjustable, and it can be adjusted. In order to really tell the story of this, especially for quilters, we need to talk about thread. And so I have with me here, I know it's going to be impossible to see the thread that's hanging off of this on the video, but this is an 80 weight poly cotton wound thread, 80 weight. I have here, this is a 60 weight poly thread. This one is used for really fine embroidery work mostly, but people, you could use that for anything. This is a 50 weight thread, and this happens to be cotton. This is, probably what you all use most often when you're piecing and quilting. And then I also have a 40 weight thread, and the 40 40 weight thread is a poly again, and this is your standard embroidery thread. Although we have a lot of people that quilt with this as well, because maybe they have a project where they want to get a little sheen in their thread. So again, I know you can't, see this on the screen, but take my word for it. I'm holding the 80 weight here and a 40 weight here. And if I look at the thread itself, I mean, it's beyond noticeable how different they are. So the 80 weight thread is literally half the size of this 40 weight. And when we say size with thread, it's not the diameter of a thread. You really can't measure the diameter of a thread because it's not constant and it's not rigid. And so thread is actually measured by weight. And so let's just talk about a standard 50 weight thread. So believe it or not, how this would be measured or how it's calculated, it is the length of the thread required to weigh 1 kilogram. A kilogram is 2.2 pounds. So think of something that would weigh a couple of pounds. My coffee filled, that's a kilogram. So imagine how much thread distance-wise, and in fact, we know what that number is. For a 50 weight thread, it's 50 kilometers. So that means I'm in Valparaiso right now. I'm sorry, I'm in Chesterton. I live in Valpo. Sorry. I'm in Chesterton right now. So I'd have to go literally past South Bend to have enough thread to weigh a kilogram. Think about that length. So that's what a 50 weight thread is. And I'm going to come back to this in a second, but a 40 weight thread is only 40 kilometers. That's all the farther I'd have to go. So it's less distance because the thread is thicker. All right. Now, if I do 80, I have to go all the way to Fort Wayne to have enough to weigh the same as the 50 here. So that's how thread is measured when you hear weight. The weight of a thread is truly the weight of a thread. Now, allow me just to complicate this for 1 second, because everyone knows that like an Aurifil thread feels thinner than a Mettler or an Iris or other types of thread. And there's a very real reason for that. It turns out that even though everyone measures thread the same way, what is different between manufacturer to manufacturer is how many plies of that 50 weight make up their thread. So I am holding right now a polyester, Iris, and this is a 3-ply thread. This here is a quilting cotton, and you'll notice sometimes it'll say like 50/2 or 50/3. The 3 is the number of plies. This also is a 3-ply thread. If I had, and I don't happen to have with me, an Aurifil thread, Aurifil makes 2-ply threads. And so therefore, if I had a 50 weight thread that was combined, and I did the same thing over here with 3 of them, this thread on this side would be 50% thicker than this one. That's the difference between an Aurifil thread and a Mettler thread, for example, or an Iris thread. There is no universal standard on the plies per weight. And that's why whenever you discuss weight, I use a 50 weight, it could be substantially different than somebody else's 50 weight. So when you're comparing threads, you need to compare within the same manufacturer. If someone says it's 50 weight, it's a good guide, but it doesn't tell you the whole story. You got to keep reading. So now that you know that, we're going to go back to tension and think about this a little bit. So the upper tension, I'm going to switch real quick here. The upper tension of your machine is created. Let's make sure you can see this. So this is our sewing machine, right? And right here, I've got my upper tension dial. And when I would thread this machine, I'm going to pull the thread down. And as I do, right between this and here are two metallic tension discs. I'm going to put this down again. So those two discs are operated by way of your presser foot arm. When you lift your presser foot, those discs open up. And that's why they always tell you when you thread your machine, you have to lift your presser foot, right? Well, that opens the disc and allows the thread to fall in between it. Once you have your machine threaded, you lower your presser foot, and now it closes. And the spring tension that is set by your tension dial, that's how hard those discs are pushing together. And that creates the tension that you're feeling. Now, let's take this as an example. I have a 40 weight thread and I have an 80 weight thread. Now, I told you they don't measure the diameter. They only measure the weight, right? But the fact is they're much thinner. And so if I took that same tension, those same tension bars, and I put a 40 weight thread in there, I would have higher tension. It would be at the same pressure, a thicker material would take more, I guess, force to pull that through. As opposed to a thin thread, it would slide through easier, even though the force between those two bars are the same. Why is that important? Well, for most quilters, you are quilting with a similar thread. So I'm going to guess that you wind your bobbin with the same thread that you have that you're going to use on the top, which means you're perfectly in balance. You've got 50 below, you got 50 above. If your tension is set correctly up above, you're going to get perfect stitches. Where things start to, you need to start to give some consideration to, and this happens all the time, people will use a different thread on the bottom than they do on the top. And so you need to start thinking about that. At what point might that start to affect my tension? So here's a little quiz. Give this some thought. I'm going to have a 40 weight on the top and an 80 weight on the bottom. If I do nothing to my machine, if I make no adjustments, which thread would show through the fabric? Would it be the thicker 40 weight or would it be the thinner 80 weight? And the answer is it would be the 80 weight. And the reason for that is that the thinner the thread, the lower the tension, and just the opposite with this big, thick 40 weight, it would be a higher tension. So that means the upper is going to pull harder than the lower, and it's literally going to pull that 80 weight right to the top. And so if I was doing something where I had a 40 weight thread and an 80 weight thread, and this is very common, for example, in embroidery. People who may do embroidery, they do this all the time. There are quilters that do the same thing. They don't want to see the thread on the back, but they do want to see the thread on the top. This is a perfect example of that. Well, in this case, you may need to reduce the tension on the top. That way it's not pulling as hard, and now it balances back out. These are the things that, that's why the dials are there. They allow you to adjust those. And so, for example, when I'm working on a sewing machine and I'm going to adjust the tension, I will literally run, stitch after stitch and just keep adjusting it just a little bit until I get it just right. All right. You can do the same thing. You can adjust that. I would encourage you because it could solve so many problems or at least have you even identify a problem with your sewing machine. All right. The next topic is needle anatomy. And I'm sure most of you have seen these, but what this is a large version of a needle. And I'm going to do my best to kind of show this to you under this other camera here. But I think this is where video starts to get a little more difficult. But I'm going to give it a try here. Okay. Oh, I'm looking at you. Look at that. You're looking at you, looking at you, looking at you. Sorry about that. Let me put that down. All right. And so I'm going to put this under here. And so I'm going to turn this. I'm going to see whether it's better to put it on white or on, there we go. So what we're looking at right now, if I turn this just a little bit, you can see right here's the eye of that needle, right? We have a point. And on the needle itself, each side is different. So first off, let me turn this around and show you that I have a flat side, right? You can see the flat side kind of reflecting towards you, and then I have the round side. On the flat side of a needle, you will have a scarf. And let me turn that just to see. You can see it's like a cutout in the needle. And what this scarf is for is it allows the hook of the machine to go close enough to this needle to pick up the thread. All right? On the opposite side of the scarf, and therefore the opposite side of the flat, if I turn this over, and I know this is a bit difficult to see, but maybe you can see it here with the reflection, but there is literally a groove cut into this needle, all right? And I don't know if I turn it enough, you can kind of see that there's a groove, but there's a groove that's milled into this needle. And that groove is there to hold your thread. And I'm going to go back to my other camera here. There I am again. And so if we talk about how a needle works, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this just as thread, okay? And so I'm going to thread this needle, try to. That side's almost up. There we go. So I'm going to thread this needle, and I'm going to pretend that it's in our sewing machine. So I got to turn it this way. And so if you think about your machine and your needle, you would have fabric down here, right? And that fabric is woven. It has, some tight, some loose weave. And this needle is going to penetrate that weave. And as it does, what happens is that your thread becomes bound next to the needle. Literally, there's tension created by way of the weave of the fabric, this thread being pushed against the needle. And what happens is the thread that's on the side of the groove has to fall inside that groove. So it literally lays in that groove. This is why you have different sizes of needles, because the size of the needle will match up to different sizes of thread. So you're probably very used to like a 14 needle or something like that. That's really good for kind of all the threads we're talking about here, the 40, the 50, and the 60. When you get to an 80 weight thread, most likely you need to start talking about a 12 needle because this groove would be too large and this thread's going to be kind of flopping around in there. You won't get enough tension created. So as I'm trying to keep all this together, the machine does a much better job of it than I do. So as the needle comes down through the fabric, the thread is kept taut. And as you can imagine, at some point, your needle stops going down and has to come back up. So this is top, bottom, center, as we call it. At top, bottom, center, what you have is you have full tension on your thread. Your needle is as low as it goes, And now it has to start coming back up. And as it does that, the needle starts coming back up. All right? And so what happens is a little loop is created. And I don't know if you can see, I'm going to move that closer. You see that loop gets created. How that happens is you are using a presser foot, remember? So your presser foot is pushing down on your fabric. It's not allowing your fabric to move. So therefore, the only thing that's moving is this needle. And as the needle comes up, the tension is relieved on your thread, and the hook, this is where timing comes in. At the very instant that this hook is created, this loop is created, the hook goes right through the scarf and picks up the thread. And it takes it around the bobbin to create the stitch. So when you say that your machine is in time, that's what it means. It's timing the bottom, and then the first millimeter or so of movement, that opens up, and now the hook comes through. So if you think about your machine could run 600 or 800 or even 1,000 stitches a minute, you have somewhere in the area of about a hundredth to a thousandth of a second in order to catch this just right. So that's how close timing has to be, for example, for it to work correctly. So the needle is very critical. And now that you know that, I'll give you a little tip on pivoting. So oftentimes you're working on a project where you're doing a straight line, you're going to stop, and now you're going to pivot, maybe in a 90 degree, maybe at a different angle, but you're going to change the direction of your stitch. I've had numerous people come in and tell me that their machines are skipping stitches. But really what they're doing is they are pivoting, and then it skips a stitch. The reason for that is very simple. When you pivot, you're always going to stick your needle down in the thread. Down in your fabric, right? Because you want to hold it there, and then you're going to pivot. Well, the tip that I'm going to give you for pivoting, now that you know how the needle and the hook work, is to take your needle down and have it just start to come back up, rather than just take it down. If you bring your needle back up, the hook is now through the thread, and even if you change the direction of your fabric, the thread and the hook are combined. They can't get away from each other, and therefore you will not skip a stitch. If, however, you only bring your needle just down into the thread or into the fabric just a little bit, and then you move the fabric, think about that. There's tension against your thread, and you're literally churning the thread around the needle. And then so when you now go to finish the stitch, the thread's not in the right place, and you can actually miss the hook. So that's just a little tip for doing something like a pivoting. So I mentioned sewing feet, and this is one that I think is very interesting. I maybe you can tell, maybe not, but I'm a little more engineering oriented than I am sewing oriented. So to me, I see these are mechanical devices, and every part of them are designed to do something. And it all comes together to create a stitch to allow you to do your art. And so one really key feature that sometimes gets overlooked are the different feet that we have and that we use with these sewing machines. And it's critical to understand why they're designed the way they are and what the use is for these particular feet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in on a couple of the basic feet. I'm going to go to this other camera here. All right, and we're going to try something super fancy here. I'm hoping, I don't know, can I expand my own picture? I don't know if I can do that. So if I do this, everyone can see it large on their screen, right?
Yes.
Okay. So here's what I'm going to do. Believe it or not, I've got a magnifying glass. I tried this once. Oh, look at that. So the foot that you're looking at right here, this in the Elna and Janome world is an A foot, but every manufacturer has this foot, okay? And I'm going to turn it over. And that's not a good way to have it. There we go. It's a little better. Get it to focus. There we go. So if you could see, that foot is very smooth on the bottom. Let me hold it up. See, it's smooth? And so this is a standard sewing foot. This foot is intended to push the thread down into the fabric. You would use a foot like this for piecing. Think about your 1/4-inch foot. In fact, I have a 1/4-inch foot right next to me here. Let me grab it, drop it off this machine. And you will see that's a 1/4-inch foot. It's perfectly smooth on the bottom. It is intended that the presser foot pressure weight is pushing the thread down into the fabric itself as you're sewing. So that pressure is burying the thread. This type of foot is used for, as we just said, piecing, maybe a basic zigzag, but that's really about it. After that, you do need to consider the type of foot that you're using. And so this foot that I have right here, again, in the Janome and Elna world, this is an F or an F2 foot. But again, every manufacturer makes a version of this. This foot, rather than being smooth on the bottom, is built like a sled. And I know it might be hard to tell, but I usually have people run their finger over this, but it's literally a sled. Those two metal slides are lower than the middle plastic. So there is literally a space. I'm going to see if I can hold this in such a way that you could see that space. Maybe not. So, but there is a space underneath this particular foot. And what it will allow is that as the stitch is formed, so this is how it's facing you, the needle is going down through here, and that stitch is now going to come out the back of this foot. As it comes out the back of that foot, it has never at any time had any pressure put on the thread itself. So the reason that is so critical, again, I'm just going to switch back. My production assistant's a little slow here. The reason that that is so important is that if you have too much pressure on a large amount of thread, you can actually alter the position of your foot. So here's a very common circumstance that happens. I'll have someone come into the shop and they'll tell me that their machine is not making proper stitches. They seem to be too small. And invariably, what it ends up being is the fact that they're using a flat-sided presser foot, and they are doing some sort of a decorative stitch. Now, that decorative stitch, I mean, it could be, maybe they're doing some applique work, maybe they've tightened up a zigzag, maybe they're actually doing some true decorative stitches, embellishing a project. But what happens is as that needle is coming down through here and creating a stitch, and now you're going back and forth and forward and back, and you're creating this very ornate stitch, this particular foot starts to deflect up. And it's made to do that. So it articulates. And as it articulates up, what happens is that this is no longer touching the feed dogs, and the feed dogs move, but your fabric doesn't. And now this decorative stitch gets really small and tight, and it's not looking correctly. And so the solution to that is to use, a foot like this. These are decorative stitch feet, and it would allow all of those stitches being made to flow right out the back, and it would make all the difference in in creating a decorative stitch. So I always recommend, if you're doing any dense stitching, any type of dense zigzagging, decorative or otherwise, to use I'll call it a sled foot. So that is a recommendation. I'm going to come back to this A foot. And if you notice, I'm going to try to hold it here against that light blue background. You'll see that there's a little black button on this. This is a feature that many, many manufacturers have. I know Viking does. I know some of the Brother machines do. I know some of the Singers do. Certainly the Elnas and Genomis do. But what this is a locking mechanism for your A foot. So I have had the opportunity to talk to many, many, many people about this locking mechanism, because people have been making masks. And a lot of folks that are newer to sewing were doing masks that, they had some large, let's see here, if I bring this, I mean, they are going over some significant pleating, right? And what was happening was very similar to what I was just saying. They would have a foot, whatever foot they're using. Most of them were trying to do it with their 1/4 inch. Some of them were even trying to do it with this foot, the F foot. But because that's such a large pleat, in essence, as you came up to the pleat, again, the foot was articulating up. All right. Well, this A foot is designed to work with things like pleats. And so how this operates is, as you approach the pleat and as you begin to get some upward force on this foot, all you have to do is push this button in, and it will lock the foot in a horizontal manner. It can no longer articulate. The key to this working properly is reducing your presser foot pressure if you're doing pleats, using an A foot. And once you push that in, if there's upward pressure, the foot can no longer articulate. But as soon as that upward pressure is relieved, the button will pop out. It's not a permanent lock. It only locks when you're under pressure. And so this foot, with the combination of this particular lock, is a very, very effective tool when you're doing things like masks with pleats, or maybe other decorative elements that might be pretty thick. It's a very, very handy, option to have if
Rob,
the feet on your machine.
Rob, before you move on, there was a question in the chat box which is kind of related to this. It says, when I go over a fold on a thicker section, I get a warning that the machine does not have needle plate, and that it states machine halted due to load. So if I lessen the pressure foot dial, would that help perhaps? It's on my Genomi 890, 8900, not on my Baby Lock Illissimo.
So allow me to, because you cut out just a little bit, just to make certain. So as she's sewing, the machine would hesitate or not sew through a thick seam. Is that correct?
Yeah, the machine is halted due to over, and then when you lessen the pressure, if I lessen the pressure foot dial, would that perhaps help?
Yes, it would, because it would allow that seam to move through more efficiently. One other comment I will make on this, and Joan tells people this all the time when she's teaching her classes, if you're going over a thick seam or anything like that, you have to slow down. Speed it just really complicates things. Slow down. There's even times where I'll recommend people just do it by hand rather than forcing the motor. But again, slow down, lower that presser foot pressure, and I think that fabric will move through much more efficiently. I did see a question. Someone was asking, it just popped up on there, what is the name of that with a Viking foot? I don't know the names to translate to Vikings, but I will tell you that you will see that there are flat feet and then there are sled feet. They're just very obvious. The sled would be used for anything decorative, and the flat would be for piecing or otherwise. So I'm just going to show you, I had mentioned a hook. This is a hook from a drop-in bobbin. This is a rotary hook, so it continues to go in the same direction. And I'm going to move this closer, and hopefully you can actually see the hook itself. This, can you see? I'm going to try to get, yep, can you see that hook? It's kind of pointing down by my finger right here, right there, right there. That is the hook that actually grabs the thread as it comes around. That is the part that is very close to the scarf. Some of you may recognize a hook like this. This hook just goes back and forth like this. It doesn't go all the way around. It comes back, it grabs the thread, it drops the thread, it comes back for more, and it drops the thread again. So that's just a different type of a hook. So I know I want to be sensitive to time. I think I'm just slightly over, but I'm just going to show you just a couple of quick pictures here. I'm going to share my screen again. So you should see my PowerPoint again. Oh, got to click on the screen. I want to talk about maintenance. So it's really, really important that you do maintenance on your machine. And my recommendations, are this. Someone who sews five hours a week, that's a typical sewist, is 5 hours a week. At that frequency, you should open your needle plate, remove your needle plate at least once a month and take a lint brush and clean out what you're seeing here. I think you can see my cursor, but clean this area out. Obviously, I've got the sides off of this machine, but you can see how much lint is here. It's just amazing. These machines keep working in these conditions. But right here's the hook. So that hook is what would come around and grab the thread. But this needs to be cleaned out. And if you don't, what will happen is the fact that your bobbin holder will begin to go out of position. And in fact, I had this exact situation last week here in the shop. A lady brought her machine in, and it turned out she had a blown fuse. The root cause of her blown fuse is that her machine looked like this one. It was so packed that the bobbin holder was unable to sit in the proper position. It moved, the hook came around, got jammed, and it blew the fuse on her motor. All she had to do was open this up once a month and take a brush and clean it out, and that never would have happened. The other thing to know is that on most sewing machines, this little spot right here in the middle of the hook, there is usually a sponge or a wick in there. And you would want to put 1 drop of sewing machine oil once every 4 to 6 weeks. If you're a typical sewist. Again, typical sewist is 5 hours a week. That will lubricate this hook. And for most sewing machines, and I'm talking more modern machines, not the Singer Featherweight or something like that, but most modern sewing machines, that's the only place that you, as the owner, would have to oil. Everything else is usually under the covers. So I encourage you to do these steps. I'll also encourage you to do to do two things. Number one, never use compressed air on a sewing machine that is electronic. So maybe the old Singer Featherweight, you could get away with blowing out with compressed air. But any of these new modern machines that have electronic boards, you do not want to do that, because you literally will blow that debris towards your boards and you can short them out and you'll lose your machine at that point. So it's only brush or vacuum. Little vacuum attachments to suck all that debris out of there, that's perfectly fine. Number two, do not use pipe cleaners. I cannot tell you how many sewing machines I've had to repair because the springs have been knocked out of place and now the machine doesn't work right. And I'll open the machine up and the springs are all dingling under there. That's because someone took a pipe cleaner and tried to clean it out. It's not going to help your machine just to jam something down in there with the hopes of pulling out some debris. Believe it or not, your machine is designed to allow that to drop down underneath the hook. And so when that happens, it's perfectly safe. And that once a year cleaning or once every 18 months cleaning, that'll all get cleared out of there and you'll be just fine. I will tell you that I have multiple customers that sew 8 hours a day. They literally get up, make their coffee, start sewing, break for lunch, sew all day, stop at dinner time. They bring their machines to me for cleaning every 3 months and they are filthy. So it's not about the calendar time. It's about how many times that your shaft is spinning, how many times the needle is going up and down. That's really what drives the need and the timing for maintenance. So very quickly, I put here that last year I went and I checked this. We did over 650 machines last year. The most common issues when people bring their machines in, they miss the upper thread tension. Remember I said you have to lift the presser foot? Invariable, people will leave that down. They'll thread their machine. All of a sudden, the bottom of the fabric will have big loops on it. They think there's something wrong with the machine. It boils down, it's nothing more than misthreading. Missing the bobbin tension bar is very common. Pulling on thread when it gets stuck. That's a no-no. So if you ever get a rat's nest underneath your needle plate, don't pull on that thread. Cut it. Remove that needle plate and then carefully remove that thread. There's a couple of springs in there that if that thread is wrapped around, and invariably they are, and you pull on them and you stretch them, they'll need to be replaced because the machine will not run correctly. So I already said a couple of other things. Wrong bobbins, you need to use the correct bobbin for your machine, whatever that is. Genomes and Elnas use 15Js. Singers, like the one I showed you, uses a 66. Brothers tend to use 15 bobbins. Vikings have their own proprietary bobbin. You need to use the correct bobbin for your machine to get the best stitches possible. Anyhow, I'll stop there and just see if there's any questions.
Rob, I have a question. I just heard recently that the titanium and the chrome needles can potentially cause damage if something goes wrong because they're so strong and they don't break. Have you seen any of that?
No, I think that is that may be true if you're running some little baby machine, but no, the needles are actually engineered to fail. I know it sounds crazy, but they're engineered to fail before your machine will be damaged. So no, I have never run across that. I've never seen a situation where that's been the case.
Here's a question from the chat room. It says, so do you work on all electronic machines, Brother, Baby Lock? I
do. The only caveat that I have is that the Bernina company and Vikings, brand new machines, if there was a brand new machine that presented with an electronic problem, because I am not a Viking or Bernina dealer, I cannot buy brand new parts for those. but I can tell you that I get Vikings in here to clean all the time, you know, the rubies and whatnot. I just delivered a Bernina to somebody. She was having a little problem with it. I tuned it up for her. So that's my only caveat, because I don't sell Vikings. I don't sell Berninas. I cannot get the newest parts. But in those cases, I always recommend that you go to the dealer because it should be under warranty at that point. But everything else, yes.
Okay, does it look like there are any more questions except one comment? It says, thank you for the great information and I love my Janome.
Well, we appreciate that. Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be with you all today. And, you know, I'm glad to hear that, you know, things are moving in the right direction, and maybe in the not too distant future, we can get together in person.
All right.
Very good.
Thanks, Rob.
All right.
Thank you.
I will head out. You guys have a wonderful day.
Thank
was
you
great.
so much.
Hey, I love that.
That was great.
That was an excellent program.